You are listening to the Power of Why podcast. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Power of Why podcast. Today, I am here with the incredible Chanel Cathey. Chanel, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm beyond happy that you're here and that we have a chance to record this conversation. I think for those listening, if you are familiar with Chanel and her work, bravo to you, because I think she adds so much light and brilliance to the world in the way that she helps leaders show up and increase their visibility. I think there's so much about her story, her upbringing, her childhood, the things that she took interest in that paint such a beautiful picture around following your curiosities and really leaning into your gifts. And so I know this episode's going to be a great one. For the audience, Chanel Cathey is the founder and CEO of CJC Insights, a strategic communications and public relations agency headquartered here in New York City. Founded in 2018, she is focused on helping leaders and brands move forward with creativity, connection, and community. Previously, Chanel Cathey was a corporate communications director at Viacom and also the co-founder of 11, an empowerment network and supper club for women that advocates for collaborative leadership and social change. She holds a BA in communications and media studies and political science from Fordham University, where she served as an adjunct professor. And she also has a master's in public administration from New York University. And then recently, she serves on a few boards. But I would like to mention Wellness in the Schools, which promotes access to nutritious foods for school kids. So Cathey, welcome to the show. I would love for you to start by sharing a little bit about your origin story. I know personally, I've heard that you've always had a connection to the media. At age 4, you would literally edit newspapers with a red marker and model broadcasters on TV. And I'm so fascinated by this. And so can you tell us more about who you were as a kid and what your origin story was as well?
Sure. I know without context that probably sounds a little funny, but yeah, my origin story begins in Bridgeport, Connecticut. You know, I grew up in the same house that my parents still live in today, and the kitchen was kind of like the nucleus. And I would, have a news studio underneath the kitchen table when I couldn't quite get up to the chair. And I would literally just mimic what I saw on TV and pretend that I was at the time thinking I'm mixing something, but it's literally just different toys and little teddy bears lined up under the table. And my mom thought that would be a phase. But then when I got older, I moved up to the chair. And then my dad was he's retired now, a teacher, so he would always edit papers at the table. So I would always see him with his red pen going through people's papers and marking it up. So then when he'd go and work, I'd get into his chair and grab the marker and then start not on his papers, but I would start editing the actual newspaper. I'm sure if I edited some of the student papers, I would get in trouble. But that's really, I would always just get inspired by everything around me. I was very much a sponge. So my mom always kept Oprah on and the news would always be on. And I just had such a curiosity for that. And I'm there has to be a process to getting that on TV. It was very early on, but that interest in media really, really sparked early.
Wow. I'm sure seeing your dad at that age, do what he was doing and for his own work. We pick up so much visually and in our environment. And the last guest that I interviewed, both her parents were educators. And the connection I see between two individuals who had parents as educators is that curiosity and that desire for learning and seeking knowledge. And so the fact that you mention, your parents and keeping the TV on so you could listen to interviews and doing all of these little things, how that's played into your story.
I think especially, they were never afraid to explain things to me and to give context, and the TV would be on, but they were monitoring it because it's I'm an 80s baby. So my mom used to notice, I think there was one time I saw all the women in New York City and they had their big shoulder pads. So I went and grabbed the toilet paper and I rolled it up and I stuck it in my shirt. And my mom's where are you going? I'm I'm in New York. This is my New York life. And so I kind of knew I wanted a life in New York City. I wanted to be in media. And my parents my mom's a nurse, she just encouraged that. It wasn't oh, this is something we don't know about and kind of shutting it down. They just kept feeding it and would say oh, do you want to interview us next on your show? And They really let me, have my imagination and really let it go. And then I remember my mom and my grandmother sat me down, and I was still probably 4 or 5. And they were like, let's do your goal list for life. And I remember writing, like, I want to work at a major news network. I want to live in New York. I want to own my own business. I want to do this. And it was just like, who would ever think that list would like come true? And it's like, I was able to like select and do everything on that checklist, which I'm not a huge fan of checklists, but I am a big fan of goal lists. And I think for me, they help kind of give me a bit of direction.
Wow. How old were you when you got to a point where you having those types of conversations with your mom and your grandmother?
I was like 5. Yeah. I was really young.
What?
She might say younger than that. Yeah. Like I was really, really young. And, my mom would say like I didn't know how to read at one point. And this was earlier. So I would just grab books and pretend. And she was just like, we really need to get her reading. And I remember we were like memorizing words at school. I was in public school at the time. My mom's like, if she comes across a word she doesn't know, she doesn't know it. And she signed me up for a summer program. And I learned phonetics, and I was literally reading chapter books like after a summer. And it was just like, I went from not reading to reading. When people say education is really that tool, for me, that's 100% true. Like, I would never have been able to just kind of dive in on all the different industries and areas I have been over the years if I didn't, really have that love of reading and just culture in general that I think was nurtured early on.
Yeah, very early in your case. And
very.
I think,
it's never too young.
It's also never too late in a lot of cases, but the fact that you at that age were already primed to soak in and be a sponge, and that it wasn't forced upon you, that you really were the one to initiate it and you got feedback, like positive reinforcement back, is incredible. And I don't think can be understated either. I learned that you actually didn't know about PR until you entered college, like the public relations space. Can you talk to us a little bit about the story around how you secured your first internship and how your understanding of public relations kind of really formed and grew from there?
Yeah, I think we kind of talked about my origin story, and it was like I knew I wanted to be in New York City. So I went to Fordham University, and they're in the Bronx. They have a site in Lincoln Center, but I knew like I want to be here, and like NYU and Fordham were on my list, and I was like, this is where I want to be. And I started out as a business major, and then I think I hit stats, and I'm like, so I enrolled in, and I was like, I'm going to do my bachelor's in communications. I'm going to study journalism. So that really sparked. So freshman year, I was already taking classes like in journalism and communications. And I remember people saying like, you can't make money in communications and journalism. And I got so much feedback that was not the move, that I needed to stay in business. But I really just kind of listened to my own gut of what I love. And I'm like, if I love it, the money will come. And I remember I went to a networking event my freshman year. There's an organization called the Center of Communications in New York. And they were hosting these, free events. You would go and you'd have access to amazing panelists. So the former head of media relations for ABC News was there. And I had like a homemade business card that I made in the dorm. It had like a giant sunflower on it. So that shows you like, I'm aging myself a bit. I think, colleges give out business cards now, but in my day they didn't. And I was like, I need a business card. So I made my own. And it was just, I don't know what took me over. I just never heard about this job before. And he's just like, everything that you see on the news, we have to make sure, like if we're breaking news, that other outlets cover it too. And I was just like, wow, that's the behind the scenes that I knew existed but didn't really know about. And I kind of walked up to him, and I had already secured kind of a summer course at Georgetown that summer. And I knew I would be in DC. In my mind, I'm like, I know there's a White House press corps. I know they have an office there. I didn't really even research. And I'm like, hey, I'm gonna be in DC. Can I have an internship? And, he was just like, how old are you? You have to be a certain age for this, because I was really young. And I'm like, I just was very persistent. And I told him about the program I was going to do. And he's like, just wait a minute. And on the spot, he called the bureau chief for ABC and said, I have an intern for you, and she's going to give you a call. So I called, and that turned into my internship at This Week. I loved it. And then that turned into an internship at Good Morning America. And many years down the road, I went back to be a publicist for a bit while I was doing my master's. You just have to seize the moment. I mean, it took a lot of... even if I don't know what I'm going to say, I'll like start walking towards someone and I'm like, I'll figure it out along the way. And sometimes I don't. And it's just like a hi and I'm doing the awkward girl stance. But, usually you can find connection with people and a hello will get a convo going.
What a great story. I can very much relate to having a thought of doing something that was outside of my comfort zone, but moving towards it anyway and figuring it out. Because I think once you've passed the moment of, and maybe backtrack, now you're talking yourself out of it, right? And so I love that was a very early story, into your career and ultimately launched everything that you're doing today. And so what was it like at that internship for you? And what did you learn that you loved about PR, having just learned about it like a few months prior to that experience, to make you say, okay, this is something that I want to focus in on and want to like build my expertise in this area?
Well, you also have to remember, aging myself a bit again, they were all unpaid at the time. So I feel like passion would drive you into an internship because no one's paying you to do the work. And I remember like having a side job to afford the clothes and the transportation to get to an unpaid job. So it was just like, I didn't have to think about like, well, how much are they going to pay me? Is it competitive with this offer? I was just like, this is what I want to do. And I'll see if I can get credit. And if I can't, it's okay because the experience is going to be so foundational. And if I love the job, then great. Then I find my calling. And if I don't, then that's super helpful too. Like then I can stop this fascination that I've had for so long and get on to something else. And, I've had honestly the pure blessing where it just clicked, and there's so many people. And I think, as they're like discovering what it is they love to do, I've been very fortunate in that I've always known. And I think that's a very unique thing. But I think for that perspective to be out there is so important because I think so many times we have that urge and that inkling that this is something that could be long-term for us, but we don't always chase it. But yeah, I just was really lucky to like have that click moment of like, this is exactly what I'm looking for. That doesn't mean that it was easy. Like there was no AI putting briefing books together. It was like me, like clips were manual at that time. It was just like everything was so, very systems based. But in the sense of it, to me, I could like lay it out and I understood it. It's like, oh, here's how you found a reporter and here's how you build a relationship with them. And here's how you like construct a press release and here's how you talk to, I just kind of like listened and mimicked again because you're always around other people doing it and you're like, how are they handling these situations? And there is a lot of that where you have to be a sponge once again, the same way you were at home. You have to like go into the workplace and kind of see what others are doing and take up the good traits that you see around, try to build your own kind of, you already have work ethic, but you don't necessarily know how to do the job. So I've just over the last 20 years have been, curating that curiosity and continuing to learn. And I think it was just very helpful early on that I was like, if you think about it, to be at ABC News, I interned at the United Nations. My first job was at Unilever. These are global brands with like really huge reputation. I feel like having some of my earliest experiences be in that pressure cooker environment of like, we're working on a political campaign or it's, a presidential election cycle or we're rolling out a multi-billion-dollar product or whatever that is. Like, the stakes are high. So I think I took it 10 times more seriously than I probably would have if it were something like, oh, this is a summer job. Like to me, I saw it as an investment in my future.
Yeah, all great points. And so did you essentially create that internship opportunity or did an opportunity exist that you were plugged into? And
I have to go back and think. I don't think it existed because they were like, when I got there, and shout out to Allison Bridgman. We still chat all the time on IG and stuff, but she was my, supervisor, and she was like, we'll find you a desk. And, she gave me like she was like, why don't you hang out in this office? I think it was David Weston was like president then, if I'm aging myself a bit. And it was like his office. And I was like, wow, like I want this office one day. But I remember Allison was just probably one of the best people to have as a mentor in that role, because she was so patient, and they probably didn't have a whole formalized intern process for that show, because I wanted a political show because I loved politics, and then in DC at that. So I was really able to make it my own, and she really spent a lot of time with me and saying like, this is how the bureau works, and like if you want to keep going, like this is how New York works. And I think back on that now, and I have dear friends that are still at ABC, and I just think like, that's just a great way to start with a manager who's patient and willing to pour into you.
Yeah. What prompted that question was to expand, if that was the case, to expand on how you kind of designed an experience based on what you were interested in and what you want to learn, what you wanted to learn about. Because ultimately, when you started your own company, which was back in 2018, unofficially, you're creating from scratch, and you're taking what you've learned from all of these larger brands and thinking, okay, yes, there is a system around how we do this. How can I enhance it perhaps? And so can you bring us back to 2018 when you officially started your company doing PR work outside of your corporate job? You thought you were only going to do it for a summer, and it ended up becoming the company that you lead today. And so bring us back to that time.
Yeah, I always worked kind of full-time in-house, like corporate PR girl at my core. And then I would see amazing founders along the way, and, nonprofits I really cared about. And I would either join an advisory board, or I would, it was kind of a side hustle of helping a lot of founders along the way. I knew I could consult in that way, or I had that capacity. But then I remember in 2018, I came off a long career, and I just kind of took a pause, and I'm like, what do I do? I can go back into that role, and, it's very much that climb the corporate ladder, or I can think about doing something different. I remember I kind of use this example often, but it really was the turning point for me. I just saw a lot of business magazines on a trip when I was in California, and there were no people of color, there were no women on the covers, and I was just like, there's a lot of diversity in business, and there's a lot of stories to tell. And I was just like, maybe I'll spend a summer figuring out how to help some of the amazing people I know get some long-deserved recognition and traction with business press. And that was really like the initial seed. I never had that, I'm going to go start a business and this is my calling. I never thought I would be an entrepreneur. Like, I was just like, that's not my gift. I want to be like a chief communications officer one day. It goes back to that, like, what I had envisioned as a child. So maybe the bold thing is just the ability to step out of like what I had always envisioned for myself to try something new. But the way I kind of psyched myself into that is saying like, let's try it. And if it doesn't work out, I have options. I can do something else. But I do think, I'm so thankful for being so naive to how difficult it would be. Hanging up a shingle is not an easy thing by any means. So I went into it with this like, oh, I'll just consult and send an invoice. That'll be that, the whole back end of like legal, accounting, everything that goes into running a business. I don't think I really fully processed that, but maybe that's the joy. Because I think if I thought about all of that, I would have probably been too scared to do it, because I was very, very scared of failing. To me, it was just like, I had a sure thing. I had this skill set and I knew what to do. And starting a business just seemed like there were so many opportunities for me to get something wrong. But then I was like, you know what? Everybody gets something wrong. And this is the learning opportunity for me. And what better time to do this than now? Like, I'm young, I didn't have kids. And I was like, I have the time and bandwidth to try this. And if it doesn't work out, I can do something else. But I think the great thing about starting an agency is that I had such a supportive network. Not only of friends and advisors, but I just had a community of clients already built in that I didn't even know were clients. There were just people that really believed in me and my skill set and my talent, and they trusted my abilities. And they all really understood the power of communications and media strategy to transform either their business or their nonprofit. And I didn't know how to construct deals at the time. So it was just very much listening to them and what they needed and saying, okay, how do I build an offering and services around what I'm hearing everyone needs and what I love to do, not necessarily like I'm going to run after everything that everybody needs, because that might not be my zone of genius. So I kind of always joke, I'm never running, a social media only agency, like that's not my gift. I can advise on it, but that's where you have to hone in and figure out what are your exact skills that you love doing every day. And that really helped me to kind of build out that first agency. And the mission was always there all along. It's how do we help people tell stories? And every story is really important. Not everyone's going to be a news hook, but what are those stories that are going to differentiate founders and leaders and companies?
Yeah. Yeah, you had said creating space for all people in all stories, which during that experimentation phase when you were helping folks in your network while you were working corporate with their nonprofits and their own companies and building up their brands, I'm sure you saw a stark difference in your day-to-day, your 9 to 5, and the larger world that was out there in terms of storytelling. I'm curious to know, in terms of your company capabilities, PR, media relations, media training, reputation management, positioning, there's a lot in there. And so when you first started, what did you double down on? What was the skill set and the interest that you said, okay, this is where I'm going to start, and if it expands later, great, but this is the area that I'm going to decide to start in?
I really wish it was I focused on one thing and went out. I think it's the opposite, actually. I kind of had a wide range, and I often joke that I'm dancing wildly out of scope all the time with clients. So you build a team around you to focus you and kind of make sure to hone you in. But yeah, I think the thing for me, I would hear oftentimes Chanel really has a knack for helping women founders and diverse founders get their story out there. And I would hear that. And I kind of was okay. But I didn't really process that. I didn't see that really as a skill set. To me, storytelling. But then when you look at it, I was yeah, I don't think people give that enough credit. And to me, it was just you can lead with a brand, but the founder behind the brand and their stories are so integral into the founding experience of a brand and why it's coming about. So I really love messaging development, and that's really what all of our clients will do in the first moments with us. We will sign on in our onboarding experience and we all sit down and have a messaging session or workshop. And that helps me to get to know our clients. It also helps them to be really comfortable with us and understanding that we know how they want to be positioned as well. So it works both ways, but that was always part of how we worked with clients. And then it was just well, what do we love to do? We really love media relations. We really love strategy. And all of those core tenants that were part of the earliest part of my business is still there. We used to do media training kind of one-off, and then you realize that's something people really want. So now it's just we've been integrating and building out parts of the business in new ways, and I think leveraging AI and different tools to really optimize the business. But I think at its core, our core services around, comm strategy and media relations, those were always there. And then based on my experience before in crisis communications, issues management, and kind of a lot of the harder, stickier stuff, we can do that, but it's just our clients know it, but it's not something, I'm not out here Olivia Pope, the fixer. I'm I don't want to do that 24 hours a day, but there are a lot of capabilities that we have, and we don't always promote them so much. But I think once you're working with us, you're oh, that's a secret sauce. Oh, They can plan a media dinner. Oh, they can do this. So I joke a lot of times. I was oh, I think we should be more mysterious with our brand. And then you realize that people really need to know what your services are and what you do. So I have to shout that out a bit more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You mentioned that initial call around messaging where you have everyone in the room on your team and on your client's team. I'm curious, because that truly is one of your gifts, like being able to see the thread and going through the testimonials on your website and what people have to say about the impact of the work that they did with you. That was a theme that I kept seeing come up over and over again. And so I'm curious if you could share here today, when you hear a founder story and how they serve a specific need, like, can you break down how you in particular uncover what their it factor is and what the heart of their story is?
Well, first, thank you for zooming in to read what folks are saying about our impact. We appreciate that. I'm like always happy to hear that someone's reading our website. But I think about it, and the storytelling piece, it's really big. I love brand messaging, but I love transforming notes like into story arcs and relevant positioning. It is like, I think my calling. I always think back when my mom would say, like, if you could just find a job where you can tell people like what they're doing wrong all day, I think you'd do really well at that. And then I'm like, that's pretty much media training. Like, let's give you a try, like pretend you're on TV and then I tell you what's wrong. And I'm like, that's pretty much it. So, always listen to those little threads when people are like, you do this well. But essentially, I think the it factor for folks and figuring out their narratives, I think sometimes there's so much hesitation and fear about putting yourself out there. There's a lot of anxiety around public speaking. So a lot of people are, just very shy with putting themselves out there. It's like, well, what do we say? But aren't we always telling stories at the end of the day? Like if you meet someone new and you're introducing yourself, what do you tell them? Or if you're at a work event and you're running into someone and you need to break the ice, like, what do you say? Like, those are different moments for storytelling. So I always tell my clients, like, don't waste an opportunity to kind of flex that muscle to not only talk about yourself, but kind of, bring a little bit more of you to the world. So even though we have all of these opportunities, we don't think about it. And we often feel like our stories aren't unique or they aren't memorable, but I believe firmly that they are. So sometimes you have the story already, or you are the story in many cases. So it's really just my job to be a guide, to help shape that messaging, to help people see the power in who they already are. Like, I'm not an executive coach. I'm not there to help build confidence, but I do think that confidence is instilled through this process because people are often so enlightened behind the fact that they're like, you're right, I did that, and we can claim that, and we can own that, or that's a stat we never say, but maybe we should. So I think there's so much power in just having someone to guide you through so much of what you've already achieved and accomplished, and figure out a way that's on brand for you to talk about those things where it doesn't feel too bombastic and too hypey. It just feels like it's right for you. And I think tone and finding the right message for folks is just a really beautiful thing when it all connects. And a lot of people see the end process, which is like a news hit, or they'll see a quote in a story or see them on stage. But a lot of times we're spending a lot of months behind the scenes getting that right.
Yeah, refining, reframing stories. It's all about the delivery, and you can give the same story to 10 different people and it can come out 10 different ways. And so I'm curious, you've kind of alluded to it, but the biggest mistakes that you see like people or brands make around storytelling, is there any sort of pattern that you've noticed?
There's a lot of mistakes. I think brands are always doing things right and they're also doing things wrong. There's a mix of both, but I tell people and I tell brands the same thing. It starts with like writing it down. So I kind of alluded to it in the first piece there, where it's just like, go back and really write down, what do you think you do? What do you want to be? What do you want to be known for? What are your brand strengths, or what are your strengths? What do you want to be, what are you proud of? These are questions you can ask yourself and write them down. And right there is an excellent starting point, both to discover that it factor, but at the same time, that's that core authenticity. And I think you need to know like what and who you are before you can go out and start branding yourself to the world. And I think that's where a lot of times people miss the boat, and they make mistakes because there's an urgency to create buzz. So they think everything is newsworthy, and not everything is newsworthy or timely in that moment. So I often say when brands try too hard to get media attention, sometimes it shows, and you don't want to be that brand. So you really want to take time to invest in messaging and strategy and that kind of narrative arc that I mentioned before, because I think that's another mistake, is when you're like, we know our story, we don't need the messaging, or the strategy will come when something hits. I think that's when you can see brands losing their way, because they're guided by kind of what people are reacting to, and they're not leading with what might be their strength. So I always say all press isn't good press, and I think that kind of comes from a lot of those mistakes I just mentioned. But our industry is changing. It's always been an attention economy, but I think at the end of the day, I care deeply about these brands. So even at a time when attention matters, as long as we're in the news, that's a good thing. I really disagree if you're in there or in a negative way. So I care deeply about the brand reputation, the executive reputation, and making sure that it's aligned with their mission and why they're there in the first place, because reputation and trust are really hard to restore.
Absolutely. And I love the attention to detail, and there's just a whole lot of thinking that goes on in the background that, the public is not necessarily privy to. But aligning yourself with the right experts that can see things from multiple angles is such an advantage. And to your point about not being an executive coach and not necessarily, not directly impacting people's confidence, it is indirect though. And I think when individuals through this process gain that clarity or that reframe, it could be subtle, that helps them see themselves or what they've built in a new light. There's so much power that comes from that, and so much focus and grounding almost to say, okay, I can stand firmly in who we are, what our values are, and how we show up in the world, which is such a gift. Such a gift.
It is. Confidence in business and leadership, there's nothing better. I think starting the business, I didn't start it from a place of confidence myself, because I was very much like, I don't know if I'm meant to be an entrepreneur. And I was very much finding my way going along, and I think my self-worth took a really big hit in the beginning, because I didn't quite know where to measure myself, and it was just like, I can't emphasize that enough, that to have the confidence going into whatever you do, even if you're figuring it out along the way, because you don't want to, undersell yourself and your expertise. You don't want to sell yourself short. And I think if you're not confident, and if your brand isn't confident in how it's showing up, you're going to miss the mark in some way. So I think confidence is so major, and I think people they just don't think about it. It's kind of like a personal attribute they don't always associate with branding.
I would love to learn more about the companies that and industries that you play in. Because on your website, you acknowledge that you're industry agnostic. So you also work with private equity, like PE companies, private equity companies, VC firms, startups, nonprofits. And then can you bring us back to 2018 when you first started? Did you have the desire to service companies across industries, or was there a particular cause or flavor that you wanted to focus on in the beginning beyond service offering?
I love that flavor. No, honestly, just, if you think about it back to my early career, it was just like news touches on so much, ABC News. It's like you could have breaking news one day, you could have, a deeper in-depth profile another day, but I really loved so many things. And even at Unilever, there's so many different brands, right? So I really love the idea of not being, and pigeonholed isn't the right word, but for someone to say, oh, that's Chanel, she's the beauty PR person. And to me, I was just like, I don't want to just do one industry. Like, I love working across all these different industries. So what's the common thread that all of these different industries need? And if you look back at the services, they all need messaging, they all need strategy, they all need media relations. And I think the media relations piece, I think we're known for a lot of business press, like we're known for a lot of, kind of broadcast TV, and we kind of shape, we're not always known for like being the fashion PR agency. Like, that's not our strength. But But I do think if you're an amazing tech startup, if you are a nonprofit, whether legacy and have been around for a while or you're just starting, I think a lot of our brand resonates with, whether it's a private equity company or a startup, because we spent so much energy in the beginning of this agency trying to get more funding into the hands of founders and really studying that. And I think that's just kind of how our agency shaped. And even if you look at like a lot of our past clients and current clients, they're in that, vein of like, how can we reimagine what venture capital looks like or the future of tech and business? So we love that. That's our sweet spot, is like, how do we take a brand and really help increase their ability to raise funds or increase their revenue? And how do we make sure they're profitable or move them to profitability? And that to me is just a beautiful gift to be able to do, because oftentimes I think one of the biggest challenges being in PR, people don't always know how to measure your impact. So a lot of times people will be like, well, that was a great segment on a morning show. And then it was just like, but what was the result of that? And it's really hard to quantify the impact of like, how many eyeballs, how is that going to drive revenue? Is it going to change people's opinion of you? I firmly believe it will, but I think our industry has always struggled to translate that. And I think even more so when you're a smaller kind of boutique agency, I think for clients, they feel that seismic difference and the shift of having the messaging and the strategy and the media moment come together. But I think as an industry and in whole, we're still figuring out how do we convey like the social media chatter and kind of all the things that come from that brand lift of like your media relations moment. Or moments.
It's a great connection piece, because I am familiar with one of your past or existing clients that specifically supports female founders gain access to funding because of the large gap that exists in that space. But that connection to then working with funders and VC firms, that I missed that. But that's such a great through line to actually thinking about the tangible impact of your work and saying, okay, where can we as a agency, as a creative agency, position ourselves so that we can make a dent in this space for a cause that you really care about, Chanel? Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
I mean, honestly, it wasn't an intent. I just followed like one of my earliest, their current client. I've worked with them, I Fund Women, and they are a crowdfunding platform for women-owned businesses. They have thousands of women entrepreneurs, founders, brick and mortar shops. People are using that tool to raise money for their business. And they were like, well, we have to do this. There's no other way. Maybe I can't get a bank loan, or maybe I'm not ready, or I would not do venture funding. And it was just like, well, what is that? Like, what are the opportunities here? What's open for us? And then, I worked with Luminary, was an early client, and Kate Lizio self-funded it. And I was just like, wow, I'm seeing like the funding piece and all the different channels of like how that can, come to be. And Digital Undivided was an early client. And, way back I was looking at like, wow, so Latina and Black women we're getting a fraction of the percentage of venture capital funding. No wonder I'm not seeing myself on the cover of a business magazine, because all of these things come together. And they really create a perfect storm when you think about access and opportunity. So for me, it was just like every single client experience and engagement we've had has been, an amazing kind of like little journey. But it's also like you're learning along the way about the ecosystem. We love to learn. We love to like dive in. And if we don't know something about something, we're like, how do we figure it out? And the funding piece was so core to me, and being a woman and being a Black woman running my own agency. And I started it with my savings. Like I don't come from money, a teacher and an RN. Nobody had, here's $100,000 to go start your thing and figure it out. I never had that. And then I was always so shy and timid. That goes to that confidence piece, to like apply for a grant. I never thought I was like, well, would they invest in a service-based business, or are they looking for product-based businesses? So I really kind of steered away from that early on, which I do regret. I think people should 100% take opportunities like that, capital opportunities. And I think for me, it was just like, this funding piece is really big. And then when you think about it, what are some of the amazing private equity, venture capital companies that are out there that understand, this mission that I have? And I've been so lucky, whether it's Zale Capital Partners or Fairview Capital, who we've worked with, they care about, amazing results, but they also see the potential in incredible founders. And I think it's just been a joy for me to really be able to service and work with people that are just across so many different industries. But if you look at it, they're all very mission driven. And those are those first calls and conversations we have. And I said to myself, if I have to step away from my business, I want to be so proud of who we've represented and the work we're doing. And I always want people to kind of step back and say, oh, I know why they took that client on. That makes sense. Not, she's doing that, and sometimes people are like, what are you up to? And then when it all comes together, they're like, I get it,
I get it.
So it's really fun in that sense.
Mm-hmm. I feel like I won't open it up, but that piece around measuring impact of the work that you do, I think that's another conversation. Maybe I can bring you in for a part 2.
Please. I'm around. Me and my French bulldog are hanging out.
Because I think it's a part of the work that I do as well that is resonating specifically in this moment. But yeah, we can turn that into another conversation.
Let's do it.
I would love to hear about the maybe most significant investment that you've made in yourself that has paid dividends. It doesn't necessarily need to be a financial investment, but an investment in your skills, an investment in doing some kind of program that has really, you've seen show up time and time again as being a really great decision.
I think it's kind of maybe one you've heard before, but honestly, I think there's maybe 2. One's therapy. I can't underscore enough how healing finding a therapist has been for me. And like consistent therapy. In the beginning, I was like, I think I saw like a therapist once when I was like 30. And then it was just like around COVID and starting a business just before COVID, you're going through a pandemic. It's super isolating. I was living in New York City and I was like, I'm really lonely. And this journey of entrepreneurship is lonely. So it was kind of compounding. And I was like, I need somebody to work this through. And I don't think it's an executive coach. And I had that moment of like, do I invest in an executive coach or a therapist? And then I was like, some of these feelings are like how I'm feeling. And it goes back to that confidence piece where I was just like, how do I let my self-worth and my confidence get nicked so quickly? And that's when I made that decision that I wanted to like find a therapy partner. And it transformed my whole life because you look at a lot of the things that it's not just like, oh, this is my personal life. Like when you're right in your personal life, your business instantly clicks on. And for me, it was just like, there were a lot of things that like, oh, there's a trend there. So when you can really step back, examine yourself and, figure out like, how do I spend consistent time with someone, investing in myself in a healthy way? That was like piece 1. And then the other piece was like, my stress level is infinitely better when my mind and my finances are right. So if I'm doing therapy to work on my mind, I need a financial consultant and an advisor to look at my finances. So you always look, that was always my like weak spot. Like if I see like, ooh, let's go get a massage. Self-care Saturday. Like I was always like doing stuff. And it was just like, I need to probably budget, but I knew I wasn't disciplining myself in that. So getting a financial consultant and advisor really helped me to prioritize things. And when you have a business, that's another thing where you just have to have everything so streamlined and understand kind of what's coming in, what's going out, and have a system around invoicing and getting things together. So those were the things that were causing me a lot of angst and anxiety. And once I addressed them, and I encourage other founders all the time, I'm like, what is really underneath like why you're vibrating in your anxiety. And I feel like a lot of people will say like, oh, I just need to listen to a podcast, or I need to get an executive coach. And I do all of those things. At the end of the day, for me, that combo of like learning how to do breath work and understanding, what's feeding insecurities or anxieties and how that can bleed into my business, understanding that, and having a financial consultant that's saying you should look at investing here for retirement, and are you doing this, just staying on top of me, made me so much more stable as an entrepreneur and as a person. And I think you're going to pay for it, but I can't tell you, it's just exponentially more valuable in the long term. So, you will have to put some investment in that, but I just think it was the best investment I could have done.
Two very great, I have no words for how great both of those are. And as someone who has an expert in the second thing you mentioned around finances, I've been hearing a lot about therapy. And I think it's definitely a conversation that's being had more mainstream. Everyone's talking about therapy and support in that way. And so I'm glad that you as an entrepreneur are also talking about that, because it impacts everything. It impacts everything that you're doing.
I'm glad you're saying like more people are talking about it. I mean, I just got to be honest, it's not something that was like, that's okay. When I grew up, it was like,
for sure,
if you're okay, you don't need that. That's kind of how I was like brought up. And I just didn't see therapy as like an option to get myself together.
Right.
I think that's just a wonderful thing, because it's moving some of that stigma around away from it, which I wish I caught that earlier. Because I honestly think, especially in communities of color, there's just a lot of stigma around going to therapy. I think whether it's personal therapy, if it's like therapy with family or couples therapy, I'm seeing so many people really leaning into that. And I'm just like, this is a great shift culturally that we're seeing.
Yeah, it's been happening over the last couple of years, but specifically with founders talking about it, I've definitely seen a growth and acceleration in that space. This was great. Thank you, Chanel.
Thank
I
you.
appreciated those two very practical and like relevant investments. I think for those who are listening, as well as you launch companies, as you grow the companies that you're in, don't forget about investing in yourself as much as you are investing in others and investing in the growth of the things that you're building. And so thank you for being honest and transparent, Chanel, and sharing a little bit more about your story. What is the best place for people to connect with you online, keep informed of everything coming out of your company, any upcoming projects? Where can people tap in?
Amazing. Definitely check out our website. It's cjcinsights.com. We're also on Instagram. I'm on Instagram at Chanel, CHANEL, CJC, and then CJC Insights has its own handle. We just started, but we're putting a lot of content, a lot of case studies and updates there. So you can follow us at CJC Insights on Instagram. And we're also on LinkedIn. Definitely happy to connect with everybody there. Come find me.
Thank you, Chanel, for taking the time to be here. And thank you, everyone, for listening to another episode of the Power of Why podcast. We will catch you in the next one.